Welcome to Concrete Block, the podcast where we dive into the latest news and current events from around the world. I'm your host, Walter, and I'm glad you're joining us today. We've got a lot to cover, but first, let's take a look at some of the top stories making headlines. In the Middle East, tensions are running high between Iran and Israel, with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araqi accusing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of attempting to drag the United States into disaster in the region. This comes as nuclear talks between the US and Iran have been postponed, with Oman citing logistical reasons for the delay. Now, it's worth noting that these talks are crucial in determining the future of Iran's nuclear program, and both sides seem to be dug in on their positions. The US is calling for a credible deal that would prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, while Iran is pushing for an agreement that would allow it to continue its civilian nuclear program. Meanwhile, Netanyahu has been vocal about his opposition to any deal that would allow Iran to maintain its nuclear capabilities, and he's been backed by some in the US who share his concerns. But others argue that a diplomatic solution is the best way forward and that a deal could help to reduce tensions in the region. It's a complex issue with many different perspectives and interests at play. And as we continue to follow this story, it's clear that there are no easy answers. The stakes are high, and the consequences of failure could be severe. But that's what makes this story so important, and why we'll be keeping a close eye on it in the days and weeks to come. We'll be exploring different viewpoints, analyzing the latest developments, and trying to make sense of it all. So, stay with us as we delve deeper into this critical issue. We'll be right back with more of today's top news on Concrete Block. Welcome back to Concrete Block. We're glad you're still with us as we dive into the world of current events. I'm your host, Walter, and today we're exploring some of the key challenges facing our newly elected Prime Minister, Mark Carney. As PM Carney settles into his role, he's got a plethora of foreign policy issues to tackle, and it's not just about navigating relationships with traditional allies. From trade agreements to humanitarian crises, the world is watching Canada's next moves. Let's break down 7 significant foreign policy challenges that Carney will need to address, and they're not all related to our neighbors to the south. Firstly, there's the complex relationship with India. Tensions have been running high since the assassination of Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in British Columbia, with accusations of Indian involvement. Carney has expressed a desire to pursue trade with India, but it's clear that rebuilding trust will be an uphill battle. Another critical area is the Middle East, where the Israel-Hamas conflict continues to escalate. Carney has criticized Iran's destabilizing influence in the region and vowed to call out human rights abuses. However, finding a balanced approach that satisfies all parties will be a delicate task. Canada's trade relationships are also under scrutiny, particularly with the UK, where negotiations for a comprehensive agreement have stalled. The dairy sector and hormone-treated beef remain major sticking points. Meanwhile, Carney has pledged to increase trade ties with countries like Chile and South Korea, but it's unclear how he plans to incentivize Canadian businesses to take advantage of these deals. The Global South is another region where Canada can make a significant impact. Carney has promised to maintain or even increase foreign aid spending, which could provide crucial support to refugee camps and developing nations. However, the specifics of his approach remain unclear, and it's essential to ensure that any initiatives are effective and sustainable. Other challenges on the horizon include reviving ties with Southeast Asia, particularly through the ASEAN bloc, and addressing the ongoing crisis in the Middle East. Carney will need to walk a fine line between supporting allies, promoting human rights, and avoiding further instability in these volatile regions. As we can see, PM Carney's foreign policy agenda is packed with complex issues that require careful consideration and nuanced decision-making. We'll be keeping a close eye on how these challenges unfold and what implications they may have for Canada's role on the world stage. Stay tuned for our final story of the day, right here on Concrete Block. Welcome back to Concrete Block, folks. We're wrapping up today's show with a thought-provoking discussion on the future of European order. As we've been exploring the complexities of international relations, it's become clear that the continent is at a crossroads. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the ideological challenges posed by certain global leaders have prompted European governments to re-examine their alliances and strategies. Now, some experts argue that the traditional EU and NATO frameworks may not be sufficient to address the emerging threats and opportunities. They propose a more flexible and inclusive approach, one that would allow like-minded nations to cooperate on specific areas of policy without being bound by the constraints of unanimity. This could involve creating clusters of states with shared interests and values, which could work together on issues like defense, climate action, or trade. On one hand, this approach could foster greater cooperation and innovation among European nations, enabling them to respond more effectively to global challenges. It could also provide a platform for non-EU members, such as the UK, to engage with the continent in meaningful ways, bridging the gaps created by Brexit. Furthermore, it might offer a more streamlined and efficient path for countries like Ukraine to integrate into the European order without getting bogged down in lengthy accession talks. On the other hand, some critics argue that this new approach could lead to fragmentation and undermine the cohesion of the EU and NATO. They worry that the creation of separate clusters or alliances could create confusion, duplication of efforts, and even conflict among member states. Moreover, there's a risk that certain nations might exploit these new arrangements to pursue their own interests at the expense of others. As we weigh these competing perspectives, it's essential to recognize that there are no easy answers. The future of European order will depend on the ability of its leaders to balance competing interests, navigate complex geopolitics, and forge a shared vision for the continent's future. It's a daunting task, but one that requires careful consideration, dialogue, and cooperation among all stakeholders. That's all for today's Concrete Block. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, stay informed.